going to be going over landscape painting and talk a little bit about the plein air approach and how that was adopted from the beginning of the 19th century and onwards, but also sort of go over some of the concepts and ideas that students can explore throughout this project. Now, the plein air approach was pioneered by John Constable in Britain, but from about 1860, it became fundamental to Impressionism. The French term plein air means out of doors and refers to the practice of painting entire finished pictures out of doors. I want everybody to sort of remember that obviously you have the option and opportunity to select any photographic reference to your choosing for the painting, landscape painting assignment. You may choose images from sci-fi worlds, fantasy worlds, photographs that you've taken, hikes that you've been on, traveling scenes, everyday walk that you go on. These are completely open to your disposal. So feel free to have the freedom and sort of exploration to explore any concept of a landscape. Now, let's review our learning objectives. Students will understand the balance of color, composition, and aesthetics from highlights and shadows. Students will identify how to use monochromatic, complementary, analogous color combinations. Students will develop individual concepts from the natural world, exploring more expressive painting techniques to create their naturalistic landscape. Students will explore techniques like Alla Prima, wet on wet paint, using their palette knives as tools for applying on the surface of their canvas. Now, all of these will be sort of experimental, and I want us to sort of adapt some of these approaches within our own landscape painting itself. You can kind of sort of see here some of these examples from previous students' work give us a great idea of what's possible throughout this assignment. For our learning objectives, of course, we're going to be using our Blick Studio Stretch cotton canvases, the traditional profile, 16 by 20 or larger. We're also going to be using our Blick canvas pads. This is the 12 by 16 10-pack sheet. We're obviously going to be using our Utrecht Acrylic Paints, all 10 colors, our palette knives, as well as a fan brush only, to sort of, again, to sort of explore other sort of techniques. And then with our mediums, we're going to be using our acrylics or drying mediums, as well as sort of a cup of water, mainly for cleaning. And then finally, our ruler for any measurements that we need throughout this process. Now, let's talk a little bit about space, which refers to the distance or areas around, between, and within components of a piece. Space can be positive or negative, open or closed, shallow or deep, and two-dimensional or three-dimensional. Now, positive space refers to the spaces or forms of interest. Negative space is the emptiness or the empty space between the shapes or forms. J.M.W. Turner's The Slave Ship, done in 1840, which is a large oil painting that he was working on, it was a great example of showing us the use of positive and negative space. We have this sort of open sea of a landscape here in the foreground, all the way to the horizon line, which is very sort of harder to sort of see from the blurriness of the atmosphere. But we have this vivid, bright white light that's emanating from the sort of center, but also sort of we see the horror of all of these innocent lives of these slaves that were being transported from one part of Africa to the New World and sort of drowning into the oceans of the sea. It's a pretty horrifying, disturbing scene, but that's what's sort of remarkable to sort of see the amount of color combinations J.M.W. Turner was using, but also sort of showcasing the tragedy of these innocent lives being killed by the ocean itself. All of this kind of refers to this idea of also sort of thinking about what one can use, but also sort of how they identify the use of positive to negative space. When we're talking about this, another sort of key component to think about is atmosphere. Now, Pierre Bonnard's The Palm, done in 1926, which is located in the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., is a large oil painting that gives us this sort of great example of an atmospheric perspective. Now, what does that refer to? It refers to the effect of the atmosphere has on the appearance of objects when you look at them from a distance. You see objects further back in distance less clearly, and their color changes in value, saturation, and hue meaning color. What this means is that further away objects in terms of space, whether if it's a sort of a general landscape here where we're looking at, are a lot duller and cooler. So they lose their saturation. They're losing their richness of color. The closer they get to the middle ground or foreground, they get what? They get hotter in terms of color. They get much more saturated, get much more detail, much more refined. The value is intensified. So that gives us a clear understanding of how we can start to dissect, but also sort of understand the difference between the atmosphere changing within an actual space. Now let's look at another example here. Just a standard photo. I believe this is the Grand Canyon I found off of Google. But atmospheric perspective creates the impression of the atmosphere between the viewer and the subject, also known as aerial view, meaning how it refers to the way the atmosphere influences the way we see distant objects. As things get further away, they appear smaller and lose detail, becoming simpler and flatter forms. One thing to sort of keep in mind is that if we're looking at this image, we have to start to identify your three key components, which is what? Your foreground, which is the space closest to us, the middle ground, which is about sort of between the middle ground and foreground, and then the background, right? Now that tells us a few things. The background's further away, right? Which is what? It's cooler, it's duller, it's much more pinker and much more purple and violet as well. But notice how much saturation has been lost from the warmness of the actual natural earth. But in the foreground, it's hotter, it's much more detailed, it's less flat. These are key components that I want everybody to sort of focus on, but also sort of to identify how do you create the illusion of space? How do you create the illusion of the atmosphere? Notice the use of color, right? How to desaturate a color. We talked about this in the still life painting as well. Now let's look at another sort of artistic reference, but also sort of think about the philosophies to the east, and specifically from artists from the Northern Song dynasty. Now, this is Guaji's early spring, done in 1020 to 1090 during his lifetime in China, Northern Song dynasty. This is a hanging scroll, ink and light color on silk. This is located at the National Palace Museum in Taipei. But Guaji developed a strategy of depicting multiple perspectives called the angles of totality. Because a painting is not a window, there's no need to imitate the mechanics of vision and view a scene from a single spot. Now, this is a very different idea from the Western philosophies of what we look at about linear or even atmospheric perspective. Because a brushstroke in Chinese painting is less a means of applying ink than a philosophical or emotional statement. Because in Zen Buddhism and Confucianism are each associated with differing brushstroke styles and methodologies. This tells us a lot about use of positive and negative space, right? We know that the foreground here is much more saturated, much more defined, and has a lot of detail, a lot of color, right? But it's lacking its value and its color and its hue in the background. So it gives us this sort of ambiguity of what's in the middle ground, which is all of what? All of this negative space. I want us to sort of think about this when we're developing our landscapes, but also what it is that you would like to create. Now, just for basic terminology, let's talk a little bit about linear perspective. Linear perspective is a system of creating the illusion of depth on a flat surface. All parallel lines, also known as orthogonals, in a painting and drawing using this system converge on a single vanishing point on the composition horizon line. Now, from this, we can kind of sort of see, let's break this down. Filippo Brunelleschi, who sort of codified, some would say codified, but also sort of again discovered the idea of perspective, wanted to use this in terms of sort of figuring out if he saw the baptistry in Florence correctly. He saw that the baptistry on the front side of this large sort of geometric shape of what's in the outside facade is flatter. And he saw that these two sides here on both left and right side are converging to a single vanishing point here to the left and another one here to the right. And notice there's a horizon line. This is his eye level, right? This is clearly identifiable, but also showcases where his eye level would be. Now, all of this makes logical sense when we're looking at architecture, interior, exterior hallways, dealing with linear perspective. Atmospheric perspective refers to the atmosphere, meaning to nature, meaning out of doors. These are two things I want us to not get confused about, but try to somehow, if possible, not work too much with linear perspective, meaning a lot of architecture. Try to work with nature, try to work with the outside with atmosphere. Now, all colors come from some combination of primary colors. The three primary colors are red, blue, and yellow. These three colors are essentially the parents of all of the other colors. Now, one thing to sort of keep in mind, we're going to use this sort of color wheel to kind of give an example of what we're going to be using. But if we move towards sort of identifying the differences between monochromatic, complementary, or analogous color combinations, these are the sort of key components to remember. Now, monochromatic color is a color combinations with one variation of a single hue. So one individual color, right? Now we talked about adding a tint, shade, or tone to a color. You can sort of here adding a little bit of the white to this sort of, again, blue-green, which you gets a lot more lighter. When we're working with a monochromatic color combinations, this is what we're using. We're just using one color. Now, complementary color combinations exist directly across from each other on the color wheel. For example, if we use the same sort of blue-green here, on the opposite side, we see the red sort of orange. And that's a dead giveaway to tell you what you should use for your color combinations. If you use yellow, what would be the opposite, right? This sort of purple violet. What about red? What if happens if you use red? You go automatically to the opposite side, it's green, right? You may choose any for your color combination painting. Now, finally, analogous color combinations are color combinations set directly side by side on the color wheel. Now, this gives us a few options. I would always like to recommend try to stick to 4 colors max. You don't want to go beyond that because it gets a little bit too muddy. So, for example, here we have the blue green, right? We have the blue, we have the purple blue or purple violet, and then we have the violet. All of these are close to each other on the color wheel. You can switch it up, and I want everybody to sort of experiment to sort of see what exactly color combinations you would like to do for your preliminary paintings. Let's look at an example of a monochromatic color combination. This is by the artist Mark Tansey, Landfall oil painting that he created in 2007. What's really remarkable about some of his paintings is that if you've actually inverted the image upside down, it would be the exact same image or a completely different image, right? And that's really remarkable to sort of think about. But here is a single American painter who only uses one single color, right? This sort of intensity of French ultramarine or maybe just ultramarine blue. Let's look at another example of a complementary color combinations. Now, this is Claude Monet's sort of the Grand Saint Lazare, which is done in 1877. This is a large oil painting that he was working on, but also showcases this use of complementary colors. Now, what are they? You have your blues, and you have your lighter oranges in the background because we see the large boulevards here of Paris in this sort of train station here in the foreground, right? So everything is muted, but also sort of dulled down from the atmosphere. Notice what's ever closest to us in the foreground, which is the train station. It's a lot warmer, it's a lot hotter, right? But notice how it's kind of getting much more duller towards the distance. It gets cooler and lighter. And finally, let's look at analogous color combinations. This is by the artist Angela Dufresne, who's from the US, done in 2010. This is a large, very large painting that she was working on her oil on canvas. But this is a great color series of color combinations that she's using, of using much more warmer, greener, reddish sort of tones for her analogous color combinations. Now, and this all really kind of helps us solidify, but also brings up the question, what is it that I want to be using for my own subject? What reference would I be using? What sort of photographic image I want to be researching about? All of these have to be sort of factored in within the sort of series of color combinations we're going to be doing. Now, for the preliminary paintings, we are going to be making 3. We're going to be using the 12 by 16 canvas pads. First, starting off with our sort of set of 3 of our landscapes using our 3 color combinations. Now, depending on your orientation, you could choose landscape or portrait orientation. It's really up to you. That's completely a decision you have to make. But remember, as long as your reference is in the same orientation, that's all that matters. So for your monochromatic color combinations, you can use dark blue, slightly lighter blue, yeah, and then you can go sort of light blue as sort of your primary monochromatic color. For complementary color combinations, examples may be red and green, blue and orange, yellow and purple, yellow green, red purple, red orange, blue green, and so on and so forth. And then finally, for analogous color combinations, you could use violet, blue, and teal, red, fuchsia, and purple, red, orange, and yellow, green, blue, and purple, and just to name a few. I want everybody to sort of remember this concept specifically, but also sort of identify we are making 3 separate individual preliminary paintings. Ideally, they should look something like this, right? Now, this is what one we did in one of the demos that's available under the modules tabs will give us an idea of this is a basic image I found off of Google of Mount Rainier that I painted in a single sort of preliminary painting with a monochromatic blue Now I'm switching it to complementary sort of colors, blue and orange. And then here I'm using analogous color combinations, which was blue, blue, violet, violet, and blue, green, right? All of these, I can also sort of use white, which is another sort of thing, key thing to keep in mind. Do not limit yourself to sort of some of the color combinations, but also sort of find the balance of how much to add. Here's another sort of example of the three from previous students' work, which also helps us, gives us this idea of the variety of what's possible throughout this project. Here's another example here. And I want everybody to remember to sort of understand, but also sort of see what's possible, but also what is it that you might be interested in order to sort of create throughout this journey, right? There's some more recent ones. This was last quarter. Again, there's no wrong way to do this. I want to also sort of everybody keep in mind. But a step-by-step format is to create your monochromatic color combinations first, your complementary color combinations second, and your analogous color combinations last. The final painting, which will be done on the 16 by 20 inch stretch canvas, should be any colors to your choosing. So keep this in mind. Here's some more examples here, giving us the idea of monochromatic, complementary, and analogous color combinations, but eventually the artist used a combination of all three. And here's some more examples here, which also gives us really good use of light, the sun sort of setting into this desert landscape. And again, you can use sci-fi, fantasy worlds, fantastical worlds. You can have fun with this. I don't know exactly where this reference is from, but I want everybody to have the opportunity to, be bold, have fun with this process. Here's an artist that actually intentionally wanted to create a monochromatic and complementary sort of color combinations only for their final, which was kind of fun to sort of see. This is sort of the before and after the reference and then the final painting. And then another sort of key component, we talked about this in the still life painting, is to sort of utilize the grid. Now, depending on whether or not if you guys want to do this, is completely up to you. I always sort of, again, give the instructions on the lecture itself. But first, you want to draw your sort of, again, left sort of bottom corner here, starting off here, making a diagonal, and do the same thing from the top right, or meeting in the top right, excuse me. Second one should be on the top left to the bottom right, and then you add your vertical line and the horizontal line, and you repeat the process to have your diamond shape. Now, this is completely optional. Obviously, if you need help with your composition, figuring out your correct space, the height of everything, I highly recommend you do this. The final painting should look like something like this, right? And again, a part of this process is sort of, again, being experimental, but also having the flexibility to sort of use what you can throughout this process. Here's some more examples here of students' work. This is a great example of kind of using darker and cooler colors to kind of showcase this colder forest with all the snow. Here's another great example here. The student is using acrylic on their actual painting. Also, it's like a waterfall that they found off the internet. Here's another great example. This is an oil painting that one of the students used, but wanted to incorporate a little bit of nature. Here's another example here of using really great uses of cooler but also warmer colors to the middle ground, foreground, and background. Love how the light is coming in from the sun from all those clouds in the background. Now, again, you can incorporate technology, you can incorporate sci-fi fantasy worlds, you can incorporate architecture, but remember that's not a part of this process. You don't have to, but this student felt really bold and ambitious, which, I'm not going to stop you. They made a beautiful painting. Here's another great example here. This was also sort of inspired by, I believe, some sort of anime. I'm not quite sure which one, but it was really kind of sort of interesting to sort of see what sort of different parts of the world would look like. Here's one. I think this student went to somewhere in I believe in Southern Asia. I don't exactly know where. This is sort of one of their trips that they went on. This was an aerial perspective of Mount Rainier that one student wanted to incorporate within their painting, which was a fantastic job. And this was obviously based off of the movie The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings by Tolkien, which is a sort of great example of showcasing another fantasy world. Here are some more recent ones that students were working on campus. The student here wanted to incorporate some architecture from India, but also sort of was inspired by sort of their love of decorative architecture. Now, the actual assignment will be due the sort of upcoming weeks, but One thing to sort of keep in mind is that students will be submitting a few things. So for our three preliminary paintings, you have your monochromatic, complementary, and analogous color combinations. Those are three, right? You have your photographic reference online under the assignment tab, and your completed large painting here for your final, okay? If students have additional questions or concerns, feel free to send me a message or email at this time, and I can sort of get back to you accordingly. Other than that, we are going to be ending the lecture and calling it a day.